Thank you. In addition to not having any underwear pictures, or indeed any pictures to show at all, I'm not going to have any sex jokes, or indeed, as those of you who've taken my classes know, pretty near any jokes at all. So we've gotten too used to the comedy club vibe that I'm really offended if you have to leave partway through. I want to talk about a theme that runs through the history of political thought, doesn't rely on prior knowledge of the texts or philosophers I'm going to be talking about, though I won't spend much time explaining who they were or their historical contexts. In particular, Augustine, who appears in the title of the talk, is not going to be the object of some substantial textual analysis. I just want to give credit to Augustine as being someone who I think we can turn to and think with, and think our problems about how to live in a political world alongside. And Augustine is a thinker who is famous as a source of philosophical and moral consolation, but is also, I think, an importantly and valuably unsettling thinker. And over the course of the talk, both the consolation part and the unsettling part, I hope, will come through. I want to suggest that three of the most famous passages in the history of modern political thought, one of which is detested by people of a broadly liberal individualist persuasion, and two of which are loved by people of a broadly liberal individualist persuasion, at root express the same idea. It's an idea I'm going to try to persuade you to reject. One of the passages. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these ends, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. I want to leave the emphasis in your memory on that last sentence, which is not the most famous sentence of the passage. To secure these ends, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Thomas Jefferson, Declaration of Independence. I have, the only obligation which I have any right to assume is to do what, at any time, I think right. Henry David Thoreau, in an essay that comes down to us under the title Civil Disobedience, but that's a misnomer, an essay that he titled Resistance to Civil Government. An essay arguing against the duty to obey, what he took to be deeply unjust taxes, supporting deeply unjust American policies, at home in the form of slavery, and abroad in the form of the imperialist war against Mexico, waged in part to find territory into which slavery could expand. Those are the two that are broadly loved by liberal individualists. The one that's not. In order then that the social compact may not be an empty formula, it tacitly includes the understanding, which alone can give force to all the rest, that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract. Rousseau argues that in order for our political life together to be a life of freedom, it must be the case that we understand our freedom to consist in obedience to what our political whole requires of us. And indeed, that the obedience shall be re-understood as freedom. He shall be forced to be free. He shall be forced to do what he genuinely wants and intends and wills to do. Because his truest will, his best will, is the general will, the will of the whole. One of these is an essay skirting the edges of anarchism. Thoreau does say that when we are ready for the government that rules not not all, that is the kind of government we shall have, and he will approve it. One is one of the signature pieces in the history of the rise of liberal democracy and constitutional government. And one is an essay whose ideological inheritance is very mixed and complicated, but certainly includes among its darker descendants some of the worst excesses of the French Revolution and of 19th and 20th century nationalism. I do not, by the way, say that Rousseau is responsible for the French Revolution or for 19th and 20th century nationalism, but those movements have called back to this passage. Why is it that I think there is something deep in common among all of these? All of these rest on the following claim. The normal condition of the political world is that it shall reflect my will. The normal condition of my relationship to the political world is that I only obey obligations to which I have consented, where consent is the measure of my will. There's a strand running through a great deal of early modern political thought that says the normal condition of politics is that we are ruled by our agreement. And indeed, that is so normal a condition of politics that there is something immoral and anomalous when we are ruled other than by our agreement. The school of thought to which, in a broad way, all three of those texts could be said to belong is social contract theory. And while social contract theory is not alone in saying the normal condition of politics is that it will reflect my will, it's where I'll focus my attention for now. Social contract theory was an attempt to solve the problem of how political rule can be legitimate. There are a variety of reasons why in early modernity that was thought to be a problem in need of a solution. Some old ways of thinking about the legitimacy of rulership, including some old religious and theological ways, and some ways making reference to the status of kings, had fallen out of intellectual and moral favor. Social contract theory builds on the intuition that when I sign a contract, when I make a promise, it is compatible with my freedom that you hold me to that contract, that you hold me to that promise. My will is not violated when you later on make me do the thing that I agreed to do. That is taken to be a bedrock, legitimate source of duty and obligation. And indeed, I think, along with David Hume and others, that we can scarcely conceive a human social system in which that's not, at least in some degree, true. Doesn't mean it's the only valid source of obligation, but it is a source of obligation that is relatively uncontroversial. And if you're looking for a way to talk about political obligation, there is one route one can take, and it's the route the social contractarians took, to say, let's think about political obligation, the duty to live under a government, and the duty to obey the laws of that government, in terms of this relatively uncontroversial source of obligation, which is promise or contract. And promise and contract are uncontroversial because they are reflections of my consent and my will. Now, in the great social contract theorists, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, there are various strategies adopted by which they argue that we should understand government as being founded on and in an ongoing fashion carried on by consent. Because, says Hobbes, we would not wish to live in the anarchic, violent, brutish, unsafe world without any law or justice. Because we would not want to live without the protection of laws and police. Therefore, we would consent to anything. We would prefer any choice to that choice. And under that kind of threat of death, we rationally, reasonably consent to an alternative. Indeed, to the alternative that can keep that at bay, in principle, indefinitely, ruled by an absolute sovereign state. Locke says something a little bit less radical. But because my life and my property and my freedom are in jeopardy without a system of laws, therefore I would reasonably and rationally have consented to creating a system of government and laws that can rule over me even when I'm on the losing side of a dispute. The government that is so created is not quite so absolute and sovereign as Hobbes, though it is not quite so unabsolute as Locke's reputation sometimes suggests. But it remains the case for Locke that I will be treated as if I had promised. I will be held to an obligation as if I had consented. When the question comes, must I obey the government in this place where I now stand? In Rousseau, the doctrine reverts to something more like Hobbes. The kind of sovereignty to which I consent, or will be treated as having consented, is radically absolute. There are differences between Rousseau and Hobbes, but in the passage I read from Rousseau, there would be no disagreement in principle between Rousseau and Hobbes. Rousseau, like Hobbes, says, when I am constrained to obey the state, I am being made to obey my will, my choice, my consent, my promise. And how do we know? Well, Rousseau has an account, like Hobbes and Locke's account, about why I reasonably, rationally would have and must have agreed and consented. Thomas Jefferson builds on the Lockean strand of social contract theory. But like Rousseau, he does think that there is an element of ongoing consent, ongoing demonstrated consent, that we must see in a government for it to be legitimate. That is, in modern language, though not in Jefferson's, there must be something robustly democratic in it. Democratic government will be interpreted as offering a kind of ongoing consent. But the foundation of government must, in the first instance, also come from a kind of consent. And once the government is so instituted, we will live under it and be bound by it and be bound to obey it. Treating our obedience as something to which we have consented, something we've chosen. In all of these cases, the political system we live under will be interpreted as reflecting our will. And so our duty to obey isn't morally costly to us. Of course you obey the laws, just like you obey your promises. It's not a moral sacrifice, it's not a moral hardship, nothing wrong is being done to you when you're being governed. Along comes Thoreau and says, I didn't agree, I didn't sign, I didn't promise. If you show me where to opt out, I will. I'm opting out of everything I can possibly sign that will let me opt out of this, that, and the other thing. And if you show me where to opt out of the whole business of government, I'll do that too. As robustly as I, as a free human being, know how to express my will, I express to you that my will is not to be governed by this imperialist slave state. And in the absence of my will, in the absence of my consent, how could I have any obligation? Because the only source of obligation is my will, my choice, my view at any time about what is right. Rousseau takes the language of social contract theory very literally and says, if you say consent, if you say promise, if you say agreement, then I have to be able to tell you that I haven't done any of those things. There is something deeply attractive to the liberal individualist, or certain kinds of liberal individualists, about Thoreau's answer. What claim does your law have on me? I didn't agree. What claim does your political system have on me? I didn't will it into being. I didn't choose it. Here's a first disadvantage with the Thoreau move. States don't tend to crumble when Thoreau shouts at them. They keep on governing. They keep on ruling, they keep on obeying. They keep on throwing Thoreau in jail. And then how do we describe that situation? If, as Thoreau has said, all obligation comes from will and consent, then over and over again, the vast majority of humanity who thinks at any given time they have some obligation to obey the laws of the place where they're standing, they say, well, if you tell me that the only source of obligation is consent, well, then I guess you've consented. There's a very rapid fall back from Thoreau's rebellion against the social contract metaphor into the social contract metaphor itself. Thoreau will be forced to be free. He will obey. And if the only choices are nobody obeys or everybody obeys like Rousseau said, then we guess we'll end up everyone obeying like Rousseau says. Social contract theory is built on a quasi-historical metaphor. Not only that obligation and laws come from choice and consent, but that governments are founded, that they come into existence at a discrete moment in time by somebody's deliberate decision. That's essential to make the metaphor work, because the contractarian asks, why would people make that decision? What would legitimate it? What would ground it? Why would the rational person choose to create a government? Here's a difficulty with that historical metaphor. That's not how governments come into existence. Therefore, Thoreau's withdrawing of consent, his withdrawing of will, doesn't actually change the existence of the government. Now, what kinds of political societies we live in, what kinds of rule we are subjected to, that does change over the course of human history. But it changes for, largely speaking, either big material reasons. Transformations in military technology are especially important. But so are transformations in financial systems, so are transformations in productive capacity, so are shifts in big economic questions about what scale of territory trade happens over. Those things change whether we're living in city-states, or in feudalism, or in empires, or in kingdoms, or in modern nation-states. But nobody sits and decides by rational will to change from one of those to the other. It happens. Politics happens to us. We don't will it into being. This is, I think, sometimes experienced by a certain kind of modern. And among those moderns are many of our liberal individualist friends. It's sometimes experienced by a certain kind of modern as intolerant. How could it be that the political world doesn't reflect my will? How can you expect me to live in a world I didn't shape? It is, I think, a curious fact that of all the spheres of the social world, it is largely only the political and legal world about which we ask that question all the time. How can you ask me to live in a world, the state of whose technology I didn't will into being? I've been born into a world in which there aren't flying cars and jetpacks yet. I didn't will that. Well, no, you didn't. Neither did I. I didn't will being born into a world in which I would learn to type on a manual typewriter instead of on a Mac. But so what? From an individual perspective, the technological state of the world happens. It's not some choice we make. I didn't choose whether to be born into a rich country or a poor one. I didn't choose whether to be born into a world that spoke English or French or Chinese, or in which people communicated through sign language. None of those are reflections of my will. All of them are background conditions of the world I inhabit, against the background of which I have the responsibility to make moral choices, to try to do good things, to try to lead a full and fulfilling human life. But there's a distinctive urge about politics and law to say, politics and law must be understood somehow to reflect my will. Given that it doesn't, given that politics keeps happening to us, the Thoreau position and even the Jefferson position are unstable. There is a tendency of them to collapse into the Rousseau and Hobbes position. Because it still keeps turning out that regardless of whether I consented to this tax, regardless of whether I voted for the party in power, I still keep being expected to obey. And in order to be something like a decent human being living among decent human beings, in order to be what Thoreau calls a good neighbor, someone whose conduct can be reasonably counted on by the people around me, of course it's the case that I am going to continue to have to obey. If we've insisted over and over again, if we've kept jumping up and down and insisting, the only source of obligation is my will and my consent, then from the background social fact that you have to keep obeying, we then infer you must have promised. Somehow it must be the case that all of the laws to which you're subject, all of the rules that govern your life, reflect your choice. And if you keep saying what Thoreau says, we are going to have to say what Rousseau said. Say, no, that thing that you think is your will isn't really your will. You think that you have chosen not to serve in the army. You think you've chosen not to pay your taxes. You think you've chosen not to subscribe to the locally mandated religion or the locally mandated religious dress code or anti-religious dress code or whatever. But that's not really you. The real you is the one who would have chosen obedience. And therefore we will make you obey. And in making you obey, we will force you to be free. The claim that politics normally must reflect the will of the government, person by person, individual by individual, the will of the government. It's the great lie of modern political thought that then gets us to all of the degenerate ideologies that say to people, not only do we rule you, but we rule you by your choice in your name. Nothing we do to you can count as your unfreedom, because everything we do to you, you've chosen, you've consented to. Probably the most pervasive version of that lie in the world since about 1800 is nationalism, or the alliance of nationalism and democracy. Democracy is ruled by the people. Singular noun, the people. What the people will, what the people choose, that is binding on the whole of the people. Nationalism supplies an answer to the question, how do I know the people when I see it? And that's a question that democratic theory has a hard time not answering. How do I know what the people is, some particular majority of whom is going to count as the voice of the people for right now? Nationalism gives us an answer. It's a complicated answer. It's not strictly ethnic, it's not strictly cultural, it's not strictly linguistic, but somewhere at the messy intersection of all of those things and politics, it says, here's a the people that's the truth. If you think you're not one of those the people, you're mistaken. If you think that you have an identity that is detachable from the identity of your nation, you're mistaken. The underlying truth is, depending on the speaker, you are Canadian or you are Quebecois. The underlying truth is you are Turkish or you are Kurdish. And if you fail to see that, you are both treasonous and erroneous. You are betraying the people that is the true voice of your will. And then, as the political conclusion of all of that, if you think that it is your will to disobey the laws that our democratic society that speaks in the name of the people has enacted, then you are mistaken and, at the border, treasonous. In the run-up to the Iraq War, the protesters, especially in the United States, but to a lesser degree in the other countries that were signed on to the project of the Iraq War, protested under slogans like, "Not in my name." Protesters understood at a certain point that it was outside their control whether the war was going to happen or not. But, they suggested, through use of this slogan, they wanted to make clear that it was not somehow their will, and the thing that this state was doing, the thing that these men with guns were about to embark upon, was not a reflection of their choice, their consent. It's a powerful slogan, but it's a powerful slogan that's very difficult to sustain in the modern nationalist democratic world that tells people the normal condition is that all politics happens in your name. In order to think away from that tradition, in order to try to think outside the presumption that all politics reflects your will, in order to try to think of politics the way that I think we more easily think about things like society and culture and condition of technology and economic wealth, I turn to the late Roman imperial Christian theologian and philosopher Augustine of Hippo. Augustine inhabits a political world that is crumbling and faces opponents of his religion, opponents of his Christianity, who say, it's crumbling because Rome has abandoned its old gods, it's embraced the Christian God, and therefore it's being punished. On the other hand, Augustine faces a bunch of Christians who seem to be unable to grasp that the Roman Empire is crumbling, and who tell a story that says, either the empire is crumbling because we've ceased to be as good Christians as we were just 50 years ago, or it's not crumbling at all. This is just the final tribulation before the second coming. Augustine introduces into Western philosophy the idea that we live in a world that does not hand out moral rewards and punishments. We live in a fallen world. And that we live in a fallen world, which for Augustine has the theologically precise meaning, we live in a world after the fall from Eden, also means that we live in a world that each of us one at a time, even if we are a very good person, is going to encounter as somewhat alien to us. We live in a world we didn't make. Politics, says Augustine, is just one of the things that happens in this fallen world. He issues a very strong condemnation of those strands in Christianity that try to interpret the comings and goings of emperors, and the expansion of the Roman Empire in particular, as some kind of proof of God's favor. God didn't give us our politics. God didn't give us our political world. God didn't give us wars and victories or defeats. We live in a world like that. Now, Augustine thinks we live in a world like that because Adam and Eve chose it. There is an element of choice at the very beginning. But for us now, God lets us live in the mess that we made. Now, this is no great injustice as far as Augustine is concerned about a relationship with God, because God promises the saved their salvation in the afterlife. He constantly says about the material world, about the political world, what does that really matter compared with the things that are of ultimate importance in the afterlife? And why would you think that God is going to hand you a political system that happens to reflect your values, that happens to make your religion look glorious in the world? What's good is looking glorious in the world anyway? But Augustine, actually, interestingly, very unlike the rest of Christian theology for a very long time, Augustine is writing to an audience that is only partly Christian. Christianity is not the unanimous religion of his readership in the late Roman Empire. There are many who are non-religious, there are many who are philosophers, there are many who subscribe to a borderline between philosophy and religion known as Manichaeanism, and there are those who denounce Christianity in the name of the old Roman gods, not necessarily because they literally believe in the old Roman gods, but because, well, Christianity seems to have been bad for the empire. We're losing our wars now. And in writing to an audience that's Christian and non-Christian alike, Augustine says to both, we live in a world that we shouldn't expect too much of. In particular, we live in a political world that we shouldn't expect too much of. On the one hand, there is something deeply sad about what Augustine has to tell his readership. The world is fallen and is going to continue to be fallen. You shouldn't expect that tomorrow or the day after, everything is going to look like you want it, no matter how hard you want it to be. On the other hand, there is a kind of consolation in it, not least the consolation of saying the mere fact that you're suffering tribulations, the mere fact that your empire is crumbling and your armies are losing wars, does not somehow mean that you've done something bad, individually or collectively. The events of the world, the events of politics, those don't reflect your moral character or moral choice. That's not what politics is like. That's not where it comes from. Well, Augustine is not centrally concerned with whether politics reflects our will. I think that reading Augustine on politics gives us a perspective from which to say, I live in a world not of my making, and not wholly to my satisfaction. I nonetheless have to live in it. I can't just jump up and down and scream at it and shake my fist at the sky. And Augustine says, even though human political societies are of trivial moral importance in the grand scheme of things, even though victories and defeats in war have to be understood not as the signs of God's grace or God's punishment, but just as things that we have to live with in a fallen world. Nonetheless, as long as you're here, you have to do your part. Even, says Augustine, the good saved Christian who believes in the Sermon on the Mount, and believes in turning the other cheek, and all the rest, must do their duty living in a political world that's going to involve violence, it's going to involve coercion, is going to involve all of the ugliness of political rule that modern liberals and libertarians are so good at diagnosing. You must do your part in it. You must live with it and engage with it. You must sometimes do your part to make it better. But you don't simply shake your fist at it and denounce it for not being pure. Purity is not on offer in the political, legal world any more than it is in the social or historical or cultural world. To live in a world not of my choosing, and still to feel a duty to do my best in it, still to feel a duty to try to make a political society a more tolerable, more reasonable, freer, more prosperous, more humane, less cruel and violent set of circumstances. That, I think, turns out to be a hard psychological position to maintain. We want over and over again to shout at the political world not of our making and say, because I didn't choose you, you must crumble at my voice. But I think that the alternative to making the Augustinian choice is over and over again to fall into governments telling us what Rousseau told us. If you really think everything is of your choice, if you really think the political world normally reflects your will, and I can show you that in the political world, normally people are being ruled over all the time, well then you must be willing your rule into effect. To choose Augustine over Thoreau sounds as if it's saying, well, I choose passivity over resistance. I choose obedience over disobedience. And there's something to the modern liberal individualist mindset that wants to reject that. But I say, instead, choosing Augustine over Thoreau is a way of saying, the rule is not in my name. When you come and rule me, you will rule me. That is part of the human condition in a fallen world. We live in political and legal circumstances, like we live in economic and social and cultural circumstances, not of our individual choosing. But to be ruled over, to be governed, still isn't something that enters into our wills and our souls. The state doesn't get to come tell us, the thing I do to you now, I do because you willed it into being. There are policies I endorse, there are policies that I don't. Whether I'm punished for breaking the policy or not has nothing to do with whether I've endorsed it. Whether my neighbors expect me to follow the laws and build up expectations around my following the laws has nothing to do with whether I endorse the policy or not. My will and my choice does not affect the external duty. It does affect what I propose to do about it, and what I argue to my neighbors we ought to do about it. But to say over and over again, not just once in 2003, not in my name, you govern me, you govern my neighbors, you rule me, you rule my neighbors, you imprison us, you tax us, you conscript us, you torture us, not in our name. If we did that consistently, not just once in 2003, I do think it would significantly weaken one of the great ideological sources in the modern world of unfreedom. A source that tells us you will your subjection into being. If you are an outvoted minority, if you are a dissident individual, if you are an individual prisoner, if you are in any way someone who is not in favor of what's being done, then, well, we just haven't done a good enough job of making you see who you really are. Let's re-educate you. Let us make clearer to you what your will really is. That idea, I want to argue, is itself a pernicious source of unfreedom in the world. And if we reject that, even recognizing that the rejection leaves all of the institutions of rule in place, then we take away a powerful ideological normative weapon that has been used for the most part and will necessarily continue to be used for the most part as weapon against human